Yes, and today we're going to be discussing the dubious expediency, how race preferences damage higher education. There's a book with a thesis right in the title. I have with me the editors of the book and contributors to it, Gail Heriot, who's a professor of law at the University of San Diego, as well as a member of the board of the National Association of Scholars, and as it happens, a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And sitting next to me is Maimon Schwarzchild, who is also a professor of law at the University of San Diego and a professor at Haifa University in Israel as well. About 60 years ago, the president of Yale University decided that it would be a very good thing to get right with the need for social justice in some form by bringing more African American students, Black students, Negroes as they were called at the moment, into Yale University. And Yale had, before that, actually admitted a certain number of Black students, but not many. And the King and Brewster thought it would be a very good idea to increase that number, even though it would mean some tampering with Yale's admissions criteria. Yale proceeded to do that and almost immediately ran into a catastrophe. Almost all the students that were admitted under this new regime, not yet called affirmative action, failed. Their failure rate was at about 50% during the first year and even higher in ensuing years. Over the course of that whole decade, the 1960s, Yale tried one thing after another to increase and keep the number of Black students on campus. Nothing really worked, but there were a remnant of Black students who held on. They formed their own group called BSA, Black Students at Yale. Brewster met with them at one point and said, what can we do to salvage this situation? And it turns out that the BSA students had a plan, and it was one that in a sense worked. They said the one thing they liked about Yale University was BSA itself. They had the opportunity to see other Black students similarly situated, and they could break off from the rest of the campus, ignore the white people, and what Brewster could do for them would be to provide further accommodations that allowed for racial separatism on campus, separate facilities in almost every area. And Yale proceeded to do exactly that, and it worked. It worked in the sense that more students were able to stay at Yale over the years. But it also worked in the sense that almost every other ethnic group on campus said, hey, if it's good for them, it's good for us. So the first up were the Puerto Rican students who had their Puerto Rican students group at Yale that demanded the same accommodations. And then it went on to really every other ethnic group on campus, and eventually to non-ethnic groups like the gay students. So the model of affirmative action was invented, or at least co-invented, at an elite university in the 1960s. We are presenting today a more expansive view of what affirmative action is and has been in higher education. Its history, by the account that I just gave, is at least 60 years old. It perhaps even has precedents before that that I don't know about. But in any case, the US Supreme Court got involved at one point, and it turns out that affirmative action raised some sticky questions for the court, which decided initially that the use of race in giving away certain public goods had to be handled with what it called strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny has become ever less strict over the ensuing decades. So we're going to talk a bit about that as well. But I thought maybe a good place to start would be to ask Gail, whose brainchild this book is, to explain just why a dubious expediency now? Why this book?
Well, thank you, Peter, for putting together this event. Maimon and I were thinking that with the rise of cancel culture, which in fact, has been coming on for a long time, that it was very important for it to be clear to the American public that there are American academics who oppose race preferential admissions. You know, that those voices get buried. And as president of the NAS, of course, you know, your job has been to amplify those voices, and you've done a great job at it. But we thought it was important to have essays written by academics, including you, Peter. I think the public would be very interested to know, this public on this particular event, that you were the author of one of our essays, and a very interesting one indeed. But we thought it was very important to have those voices be made clear. You know, the American public has long opposed race preferential admissions. If you go back to polls starting in the 1970s, it's always been very clear. And the more clear the question is made in a polling question, the more they oppose race preferential admissions, even when the best arguments in favor of race preferential admissions are made part of the question. The American public opposes race discrimination of any kind, even the well-meaning kind. As I think, you know, it's fair to say that most people who favor race preferential admissions think that somehow they're doing a good thing. And the essays in this book, in part, lay out exactly why that's not true, why race preferential admissions have backfired badly. You've been talking about the racial separatism that race preferential admissions have led to. One of the authors in our anthology, Peter Kirsanow, who was my colleague on the US Commission on Civil Rights, has written an essay about campus separatism. And that's something that a lot of people who don't deal on a regular basis with higher education, it might be because, you know, they graduated 30 years ago and don't realize how far it's gone. It's important they know about that. And as I've said, the American public is on our side, but they don't always hear the reasons. The reasons that race preferential admissions have damaged higher education so much. Here in California, we just, back in November, we had on the ballot Proposition 16. Proposition 16 would have repealed an earlier popular initiative, Proposition 209, which amended the state constitution way back in 1996 to include a provision that says the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment on the basis of race, color, sex, ethnicity, or national origin in, among other things, public education. So it has outlawed race preferential admissions here in California. Our deep blue legislature tried to repeal it. And everyone thought, well, California is so deep blue, there is no way in the world that this repeal is not going to go through. And conservatives here in California were very worried. We were outspent 16-1. But guess what? Even here in California, opposition to race preferential admissions is so strong. We won that election overwhelmingly. And you know, that's important. But the average American doesn't know just how badly these admissions policies have backfired. And this book, and here it is, I've got it here in my hands, I think will help conscientious voters understand exactly what is happening.
I'm going to turn on that to Maimon. Your essay in the book deals with the idea of class-based affirmative action, but very early in your essay, you have about a page and a half in which you summarize all the things that have gone wrong with race-based affirmative action. And I don't think I've ever seen in one compact place so many of the defects of race-based affirmative action laid out so clearly. Can you remind us what some of those are?
I think, Peter, the idea of racial preferences and what has become called affirmative action was introduced for the most part with good intentions, beginning, as you say, perhaps even before the 1960s, but really taking off under the affirmative action label in the 1960s, and then really taking off in the 1970s. And the ideas behind it, the creditable ideas behind it, were to make up to compensate for racial injustice, of which there had been no shortage in the history of the country, to improve integration of, in particular, Black students and Black people in the country into the economy and into upward mobility, economic and social mobility, to improve education, and to move towards a kind of racial healing in the country that had been racially divided and discriminatory in many ways for years and decades, and in a sense for centuries before. The effect of this, it seems to us, I think all of us, the authors of this book, and to a majority of people in the country who see what the consequences of this have been and what the impact of this have been, has been in a way exactly the opposite of the putative intent of the policy right from the beginning. This, far from improving education, has put downward pressure, severe downward pressure, on academic integrity and on the educational effectiveness of higher education, and then increasingly, as this spreads out almost metastatically into the rest of the country, in the schools from kindergarten to graduate school.
Is that the fault of the policy, or is it the fault of the way it's been implemented by administrators?
It seems, I think, to me, and I think to most of us who participated in this book, that ultimately it comes down to the policy. That if you have a policy of racialism, essentially, of racializing higher education, and then what you do in the universities spreads to the country. The universities are a part of the country. They're really an essential part of the ethos and of the ideas that prevail in the educational system, and then ultimately beyond the educational system. And if you racialize the higher education to begin with, it doesn't deracialize the country; it further racializes the country, and that isn't incidental. That's central to it. So the quality of education has been great pressure, downward pressure has been put on that by this, and above all, in a way, the idea of integrating, assimilating, in particular Black students, into better jobs, better life prospects. It has had the opposite effect, because if you mismatch the qualifications of students coming into a given college, the people who are brought in with very much worse qualifications than the main body of the students, they're going to find themselves at the bottom, and the effect of it is to segregate qualitatively the educational experience and to guarantee failure to students who are brought in who themselves would be perfectly right in the center of some other school. But so I'm a Black kid, and my high school grades, my college boards would qualify me to get into college X. Affirmative action means that I'm going to be brought into college Y, which is more prestigious than college X, and has on average higher standards than college X. And now, instead of being admitted on my merits into college X, where I have an excellent chance of doing well, of doing fine, I'm admitted to college Y.
Yeah, that kind of gets into my essay on Mismatch. And I think this is probably the biggest way in which race preferential admissions have backfired. And the basic message is this, we are not doing students favors by giving them preferential treatment, being admitted to a school where your academic credentials put you towards the bottom of the class. Rather than that being a guarantee of success, it turns out to be the opposite. We now have fewer African-American engineers, fewer African-American scientists, fewer African-American physicians than we would otherwise have if students of all races attended the school where their academic credentials put them in the ballpark with other students. I know to some people that is counterintuitive, but it's not to me. So maybe it's worth it to spend a little time on this. There are now quite a number of empirical studies in the STEM area, in the area of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics that show African-American students are actually just as likely and actually somewhat more likely than white students to want to major in STEM. And yet the attrition rate after the first year of school is enormous for African-Americans, just enormous relative to white students. And why is that? Well, when you start looking at entering credentials, it becomes obvious. It's not race, it's academic credentials that matter. And students who are in the bottom 10%, bottom 20% of their class, they will tend to drop out of STEM courses and migrate into majors that are less strenuous academically. And the problem is STEM, that's where the jobs are. That's where the high prestige jobs are. And not necessarily in majors like communications. But that's where African-American students go. They don't end up in medical school. It's not just affirmative action beneficiaries. It's anybody who receives preferential treatment. Legacy preferences do the same thing. If your granddaddy went to Harvard and the only reason you got into Harvard is because he went to Harvard, that student is not being done a favor. They've actually got a greater chance of making it in a STEM major, making it onto medical school, onto an advanced degree in engineering, if they go to a school where their academic credentials put them in the ballpark with other students.
Let me push back a little bit on this. Okay, maybe we have fewer Black doctors, engineers, and people in the STEM fields, but if you compare today to 1960s, there is a larger and robust Black middle class, largely made up of people who went to college and who have succeeded financially in life. So what if they aren't doctors or engineers? They're making a good living and supporting intact families and moving into the suburbs. So affirmative action in a broader sense has been a roaring success. What's wrong with that?
The point is we'd have more of them. We'd have more. And I want more. I want full integration. And that's a problem. Starting even before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, African Americans were starting to expand. They were doing well. And instead of keeping up on that upward trend, we've stalled. And we've stalled in part because of race preferential admissions. We'd have more doctors, we'd have more dentists, we'd have more engineers, we would have more lawyers in all likelihood. There's the studies in the law school area are a bit more limited. When it comes to STEM, I can say unequivocally, we'd have more without race preferential admissions. But when it comes to lawyers, I wish we had more studies, but what's happened is that people who are in favor of race preferential admissions have made it impossible for researchers like Richard Sander at UCLA, who did the original law school study and found that indeed we'd have more lawyers if more law students were going to the schools where their academic credentials put them in the ballpark with other students. He did this one study and his opponents, ideological opponents, prevented him from getting access to data that would allow him to do a second study. He has managed to do another study in recent years that again confirms what he was saying in the first place. But we would have higher quality research if only those people who had supported race preferential admissions in the past were humble enough to think, you know, I could have been wrong. I could have been wrong. Let's check and see. I think that speaks volumes.
The premise of the question is that nothing would have changed after 1960 or 1950 or 1930 without race preferences. And there's enormous evidence that that's not right. There had been pervasive discrimination, especially in the South, where most Black Americans live, well into the middle of the 20th century, which prevented the growth of a Black middle class growing without discrimination. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and the ensuing civil rights laws, federal and state, remarkably quickly and remarkably after a long gap and remarkably pervasively did away with that culture of discrimination. So that whereas the 1960s began, Jim Crow and segregation in the South still were overwhelmingly pervasive. By 1970, they were gone. And the idea that at that point, Black students and Black Americans wouldn't be able to move into the middle class as they have done without special treatment, without special preferences. There's no reason to think that, and a lot of reason to think the reverse. That the cliche is colorblind, in a non-discriminatory, which is really what colorblind means, in a non-discriminatory climate and America, Black Americans, like all Americans, are you have to trust people, and there's good reason to trust people to make it on fair and impartial standards. And there's absolutely no reason to think that Black Americans, like people from all kinds of other backgrounds who have done so, wouldn't have moved into the middle class without the bitterness and without the separatism that affirmative action has created. Because one of the Gail and you, Peter, have talked about some of the effects of the mismatch in these preferences create in higher education. But a crucial one, and a really poisonous one, is that if you are set up for failure by mismatch, that isn't a happy experience. That's an embittering experience. And if I'm a kid, I'm admitted to a school where I'm going to be at the bottom of the class if I don't fail out entirely. It is entirely natural that I'm going to be pretty angry about that. And we see on the campuses and increasingly in the country a bitter anger in the minority communities, in particular the Black community, and most particularly of all in the segments in the constituency of the Black community that have been the putative alleged beneficiaries of affirmative action, and who, understandably enough, naturally enough, have resorted to self-segregation in a situation on campus where they feel out of place.
Well,
Peter, before you carry on, may I ask all of you to speak loudly and clearly at the camera? All right,
okay.
Thank you.
Will do. Well, we're at this moment in the nation's history right now where there are a lot of prominent Black people who think that the advances have not been so great. They're with Gail in saying something is holding people back, but they don't think it's affirmative action that's holding people back. They think that it is white racism or systemic racism or white supremacy. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram X. Kendi have become the major voices for this, but they are two of a great many who find this an entirely persuasive diagnosis and one that is utterly the opposite of the diagnoses that are put forward in dubious expediency. Are they right, or are we just barking up the wrong tree here?
I will say here, no, they're not right. They're not right. And it's not surprising that people will look at a situation like this and say, why isn't it working? Why isn't it the case that African Americans are doing better than they are? And I feel like this is one of those situations where I can actually make some progress here. I can increase the number of African American scientists, doctors, physicians. By the way, there's also an empirical study showing that we would have more college professors generally, that African American students would be more likely to go on to graduate school if they'd gotten good grades at the school they were at. That's the deal here. You take someone's academic credentials. Some students will outperform their entering credentials when they get to college. Some students will underperform their entering credentials once they get to college. But most students are going to perform in the general range that their academic credentials say. And because of that, that's why we're in this position where we know that with race preferential admissions, that means that African American students will disproportionately get grades that are towards the bottom of the class. And that when they do, like any student who's getting grades that are towards the bottom of the class, will feel like, well, this isn't really my forte. This isn't the stuff that I'm good at. I'm good at something else. And they're less likely to pursue academics as a career on account of that. And that's hugely important, but it's the sort of thing that kind of goes below the radar screen for many people. And it's important that all the people throughout the last 50 years who have sort of staked their reputation on the notion that race preferential admissions is what's going to help, they got to step back and recognize the possibility that all this empirical literature is true, and that we actually would have more academic successes if African American students in particular were not being given preferential treatment. I mean, some people make the mistake of believing, oh, you're keeping people out of college. Nonsense. There are colleges and universities at every level. Most colleges and universities admit everyone, and there are all sorts of degrees of selectivity. And take a school like MIT. I mean, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? When I was in high school, I was pretty good at math, but not that good. Not that good. If you'd thrown me in with a rocket scientist at MIT, my guess is, I'd have been towards the bottom of the class, and I would have thought, well, I don't really like math after all. But I didn't go to MIT. I went to Northwestern, and a great school it was at the time. I don't know about whether it is right now. But when students go to a school where they're in the ballpark, where they can compete, they learn to compete. And they're much more likely to do well, and they're much more likely to learn something. I'd have been lost, thrown in with the very, very, very best math students in the country. But nevertheless, I can do fine competing against people at a highly selective school. And the same is true for everyone. When you're competing against people whose entering credentials are in the ballpark with your own, it's real sport. You can compete, you can do well, and you can come out and go on to graduate school. If you've done particularly well, you might go to a more competitive school than you went to in the first place. But there is plenty of evidence at this point that mismatch is a problem, and it's a problem not only in the sense that I'm talking about, that we have fewer success stories than we would otherwise have, but it also affects the culture. Grade inflation. Back in the day, early on, I think grade inflation was in part connected to the draft, to the Vietnam War. Students got flunked out of school. They'd be subject to the draft. There were professors who didn't want their students to flunk out, and therefore they were disinclined to do that. But affirmative action is what started it on this long escalation. I have spoken to academics who've said, look, I've got students in my class who probably shouldn't be here, but they were given, preferential treatment because of their race. They are trying, and I don't feel it's appropriate to fail them. Well, if you're not going to fail them, then you're not going to fail the student who actually has higher academic credentials, but is just a slug and isn't willing to do the work. And over time, creeping ever so slowly, that has gotten us in the position that we're in now. And it's a deep problem, I believe.
It's not an accident that not a coincidence that critical race theory and the idea of systemic racism, namely that everything in the country, the Constitution, the founding of the country, the history of the country, the institutions, separation of powers, freedom of speech, liberty, all of these things are racist. And by the way, academic integrity is also racist. So mathematics is racist. Grammar is racist. Hard work is racist. Intact families are racist. All of these ideas, which come as a package in critical race theory and the idea of systemic racism, it's no coincidence that this emerged on campus. And why did it emerge on campus? Because I'm a Black kid. I might be a member of the faculty, but I see the kids of my race, of my group, coming in, and they're at the bottom of the class. Nobody wants to feel that I failed because I'm not, because I haven't done well. And it is understandable to feel if I and people that look like me are all at the bottom of the class. It's not because we haven't done as well as we could do or should do or would have done on another campus. It's because of racism. It's because
Get closer to the microphone.
Yep. It is. I hope I could. Shall I repeat what I said a minute ago? Or was this audible enough? That I'm a Black kid, or I'm a member of the faculty, and I see Black kids, Black member of the faculty, and I see Black kids. They're all at the bottom of the class, either I have to say and feel, well, I haven't done as well as I'd like to have done, and by the way, as well as I would have done on another campus, or I haven't done as well as others here because I've been discriminated against because of racism, because of systemic racism. Perfectly understandable that I would go for that second explanation. And very significant numbers of people, mostly the beneficiaries of affirmative action. It's not working class Black voters, who, by the way, to the disappointment of the Democratic Party, broke more even for Donald Trump, or perhaps especially for Donald Trump in 2020 than the Democrats would have wanted them to do. It is specifically the university higher education class in the Black community that has been embittered by the affirmative action experience and who have gravitated to the idea of, well, it's systemic racism, critical race theory, ideas that are now being brought into kindergartens and into elementary schools, and are, to say that it's tearing the country apart is, I hope, hyperbolic, but it is certainly something that is dividing the country bitterly. These are in a sense, you could say these are the predictable effects of the affirmative action regime that has gone on now for more than 50 years. To be fair, it would take a lot of perception 50 or 60 years ago to see where this would go. There were a few people who did, but whether it was predictable or not, it has happened. And what the thing that we have done in this book, and I think it's important to do, is to say it's not too late, it's never too late to get back on a better road.
Well, this issue of was this predictable? I mean, what I find interesting, we called the book A Dubious Expediency, and we didn't make that phrase up. That actually comes from an opinion of Justice Stanley Mosk of the California Supreme Court. Those of you who are around my age, I'm sure remember the case of Alan Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California. Alan Bakke was the son of a mailman who wanted to go to medical school at the University of California at Davis. And he was not admitted. Instead, even though his credentials were very, very good and much better than the minority students who were admitted, he didn't get into medical school. And so he brought a lawsuit. And before it became a lawsuit before the United States Supreme Court, it was before the California Supreme Court. Stanley Mosk was what I would call a liberal's liberal. He would just shudder to think today that it's conservatives who remember him best. But he was always on the side of civil rights as a Superior Court judge way back in the 1940s. When he was Attorney General of California, he established a special civil rights division there. And he, for example, did not allow the Professional Golfers Association to use state golf courses because back in those days, the PGA discriminated. But when the Bakke case got before the California Supreme Court, this was a great moment for Mosk. I mean, he'd worked all his life for what he saw as colorblindness in the law, non-discrimination. And suddenly the arguments were being made the other way, that we have to discriminate in favor of African Americans in order for justice to be done. And he was having none of it. The California Supreme Court, in an opinion written by Justice Mosk, was very strong on the side of no, the state of California cannot discriminate on the basis of race, even when its intentions are theoretically good. And he called this a dubious expediency. And Maimon and I are honoring Justice Mosk by calling our book A Dubious Expediency. And he foresaw a lot of this, as Thomas Sowell foresaw a lot of this, and a handful of others. Unfortunately, most did not. And once it got started, it was very, very difficult to stop it. And it's still difficult. We've had great success here in California and a handful of other states, but most states don't have popular initiatives.
Gail, I want to bring up what I'm going to call the how dare you question. A few days ago, a prominent civil rights attorney here in New York City, friend, a black man, emailed me basically with the question, how dare you hold this event with Gail and Maimon and have no black people on the screen? That's just unacceptable today. I think that was the word that he used. I haven't replied to him yet. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I should say. Do you have some counsel about that?
Well, this is the whole point, that we shouldn't be bean counting. We're talking about 3 people here. In fact, if you look at the authors of our essays, they are, of many different races. We have Peter Kirsanow, we have Lance Azumi, and that came by not because we thought, golly gee, we got to make sure we have, everybody of every possible background with these essays. It's because those were the people that I thought would write the essays that would be useful. It is not at all shocking that when you have 3 people at a seminar, that 3 of them would be white. There was a day when it might have been unusual to have like 2 men and a woman, or 2 Gentiles and a Jew. But like now you have to have every race in the world in order to be able to say anything about race. And I think that's wrong. I think that it's important that you answer him forthrightly, that, these were the people who actually co-edited the book. So they were the obvious people to have on. And, we have to get over this notion that every single time you turn around, you have to genuflect in the direction of those who insist that like there be someone of every race. You're not going to have that when you have 3 people involved in something. And so like now is the time for a little civil courage, I think. People have to be willing to talk about race issues, regardless of whether or not they can say, well, I happen to be a member of a particular race. Everybody has to speak up and be heard. And I hope that this book will in some way help people have that civil courage to understand that there are a lot of people on their side, including people who are academics and therefore have seen this up close. And that's the best I can do with that question.
One of the sort of poisonous things really about these policies over the last decades is that it tends to channel people into feeling that they've got to think in terms of their race. And you hear at meetings, not just academic meetings, but increasingly across the country, people will begin almost anything they say in a group, speaking as a, as a Black person, as a, not so much as a white person, speaking as a member of this putatively favored group or of that affirmative action group, and very difficult once you preface what you every time you speak, but with that to say anything that that's independently thought out and that might differ from what's expected from a representative of Group X. This isn't a recipe for people thinking through things and coming to some independent judgment. This is a recipe for people of each race to be locked into a kind of monolithic and false unanimity that divides people and makes it impossible for anybody to persuade anything of anything. If I say, well, speaking as a Anglo-German, Sephardic, Ashkenazic Jew, X or Y, if you don't happen to be in those categories, you're not going to be persuaded. That's not a recipe for people coming together and making some intellectual sense, some human sense in the world. It's a recipe for dividing people. That's probably a long-winded answer to give to your friend. But I think what Gail said just now, I think that thought is right.
Right. I do want to give sort of not equal time, but some time to the opposite point of view. Ibram X. Kendi's most recent book, The Anti-Racist Baby, which is a good maybe 12 pages long and has lots of sound advice on how we can overcome racial disparity in this country by learning that all whites are racist and that it will take a positive effort to become an anti-racist every moment of your life. That's the Cliff Notes version of the book. But it's very important to know that this stuff can be now taught to people who are pre-K. This has become an ideology that's widely available in for every size and shape in the country. Now,
this sounds like a joke, but if you know the way things are done in totalitarian countries, if you know what was produced in Nazi Germany, if you know what was produced in Soviet Russia and China, the propagandizing of children from the age of, that book looks as though it's sort of the Cliff Notes version would be the sophisticated version. This is produced for 3-year-olds,
or for their parents, really,
and for the parents of 3-year-old and less than 3-year-old. This is propaganda, and this is indoctrination, and this is pretty scary. It's what happens not in free societies. What happens in societies where you are not from the earliest age brought up to think independently and to think creatively and to think without being told what to think. Quite the contrary.
There's lots of interesting questions and comments in chat that I want to get to. Before I do that, though, I think that this is a good time to, in effect, explain what this book has to offer other than just a bunch of more or less conservatives grousing that they don't like affirmative action. What do you get out of reading this book that you didn't already know?
I think what people get out of this book that they didn't already know is just how extensive the empirical research is showing that race preferential admissions have backfired. They will learn just how extensive that neo-segregation on campus is. They will learn a little bit about how Asian Americans in particular have been hurt by race preferential admissions and the extent to which Ivy League schools discriminate against Asian Americans. And they will learn about how people had misgivings about race preferential admissions way back in the 1970s and how they have corrupted higher education, and how very often this is not well thought out policy on the part of colleges and universities. Rather, it's a result of pressure from state legislatures, from student protesters, from well-meaning, but I think misguided foundations that dangle large sums of money in front of colleges and universities, which the colleges and universities then jump for. And all of that, I think, is important to understand exactly how this has become so well entrenched, and why we need to get on the road back in the other direction. One thing I didn't point out that I want to say, because I want to make sure we get out here, back in California, where I am, where we defeated Prop 16, where Proposition 209 remains part of the state constitution, and that therefore race preferential admissions have been outlawed. Granted, the University of California tries very hard to get around it, and sometimes they do. But nevertheless, right after Prop 209 went into effect, guess what happened? A researcher at Duke University, Peter Arcidiacono, did a study of the University of California under Prop 209. And what he found was that after it went into effect, grade point averages for African-American students went up. The number of African-American students who major in STEM went up. The percentage of African-American students who graduate from the school that they enter went up. That is a triple crown, ladies and gentlemen. That means that Prop 209 did exactly what we hoped it would do. And granted, the University of California does try to get around it, but they can't quite get around it. And so it remains part of the state constitution, and it continues to have a positive effect on African-American students. They may not know what's doing this good for them, but it's there, and it's doing what it should do.
Two more things in the book that I think you will learn as a reader. We encourage you to be a reader of it. One is the extent to which around the country, most of which has not had Proposition 209 the way California has. Around the country, the sciences, it's not just the humanities, it's certainly not just the ethnic studies departments that have been transformed by the ideology that goes along with affirmative action. It's increasingly the maths department, the chemistry department, the physics department, the medical schools that are transforming their curriculum and watering down the substance of their curriculum in order to cover over the enormous differences, and the differences are enormous, in qualifications of affirmative action admittees and of everybody else. And so if you might be tempted to think to yourself, well, the sociology department, it doesn't matter very much what they're doing there. If they want to corrupt their curriculum, well, let them go ahead and let them go ahead and play. It's not just the sociology department. It's increasingly the sciences and the basic sciences for which, at a time of COVID or any other time, the health and well-being of the country depend on, and of the world, that are being affected and infected by this. And relatedly, the other thing that you learn from this, and if you're not in a campus world, you have no reason to be aware of, and certainly not to be fully aware of, is how big this has become. It started small. One of the essays in the book by John Ellis rightly, I think, says that this began in the 1960s with everybody thinking it's going to be a light finger on the scale for a brief time that would accelerate opening up higher education in particular to Black students in particular. And it wasn't going to be a big deal. It wasn't going to last for a long time. And it certainly wasn't going to transform higher education and ultimately the country. It has grown constantly. Bureaucracies have been created with an immense interest in expanding this and in keeping it going. And the result now is that on university campuses and increasingly elsewhere, this is all anybody thinks about. And this is all anybody talks about. And the entire curriculum, and the entire hiring process, and the entire atmosphere of the campus is monopolized by this, not in a good way. I think if you're outside this world, and you might be tempted to think, well, you know, it may be good, it may be bad, but it's a little thing. It's certainly not an overwhelming thing. Why don't we worry about other things? You need to know what the facts are, and the reality is that this is this sort of monopolizes. You cannot talk to an academic dean or an academic president without the word diversity coming out of their mouths within 10 seconds of when you talk to them about anything. So just the sheer extent of this is something which is kept under wraps to some extent by the university, you know, the public relations people. But the reality under the wrap is under the cellophane is that this is just enormous, and as I say, not in a good way.
Hey, I've got an anecdote for you that I think illustrates the culture issue here. Here in California, at the University of California, back before Prop 209 went into effect, they had something at UC San Diego called the Bridge Program, and they would invite over the summer beneficiaries of race preferences to a special summer program that would begin before their freshman year. And I saw the curriculum for this program, and it was just ghastly. Basically, they were telling these students, you're going to get here, everybody's going to be racist, everybody's rich except you. You know, they've all got millionaire parents who are buying them condos and tutors and everything, but, you know, hang on, you know, we'll do the best you can, but this is going to be a miserable experience for you. And then when Prop 209 went into effect, instead of just ditching the program, they invited students who were first in their families to go to college, which was disproportionately racial minorities, but not totally. But as far as I know, nobody had ever complained about the Bridge Program before, even though it was really just, I'm not making this up. I mean, it read like a Marxist diatribe. Finally, that year that Prop 209 had gone into effect, the students at the Bridge Program, they were of many different races, but their academic credentials were as good as any other students. And a Hispanic student went to a member of the National Association of Scholars who was on campus and raised holy hell, said, you know, why are these people telling me that I'm going to fail? Why are these people telling me that all the professors on campus are going to be out to get me? You know, people have to understand the extent to which having those lower credentials makes students defensive. And when it's going to be disproportionately racial minorities, they're going to see it in terms of race. You know, it's true that every school has to have somebody who's going to be, you know, having the lower credentials on campus, but it doesn't have to be, you know, a good deal lower the way it is with preferences. And it certainly doesn't have to be a situation where it is almost exclusively racial minorities, which is going to teach those students that it's your race. That's what makes you different. That's why you're getting low grades. They don't like you. And anyway, that's my story. That with Prop 209, you finally got minority students who could compete. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to compete academically and did so.
Before we started recording, Maimon used the phrase, racial disaffinities have flared these days. Well, I think that's very nicely put. The flaring of those disaffinities is pretty apparent in the chat section and some of the questions coming in. The institutionalization of racial preferences, which has turned into incentivizing of resentments and that sort of thing, has been discussed. We've got two attorneys here. I would like each of them to say something about the role of the courts in having created this regime. I'm still sore about Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion in Grutter in 2003. I had just come out with a book before that celebrating the prospect that the court in the Grutter case was going to bring an end to the racial preference regime. And it turned out that I had to give up my career as a prognosticator because of her. But she's not the only one. We've had generations now of jurists who have felt for one reason or another that they had to endorse this stuff. Why?
Blame it on Justice Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell was the one justice back in 1978 in the Bakke case who ended up, controlling the whole situation. There were 4 justices who said, look, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 says you can't discriminate by race, period. End of story. There were 4 justices who said, well, under the Constitution, like we should be more willing to accept discrimination against the majority. That's not such a bad thing. Anything to help minorities is okay with us. And Lewis Powell, who sort of thought he was in the middle, he said, well, in general, it's a bad thing. And I'm going to rule in favor of Mr. Bakke here because they've done it in a way that just seems so icky. They set aside a particular number of seats, and that's just icky. But it'll be okay if schools give a little bit of an extra bump on the ground of what he called diversity. And that was actually one of the minor arguments that the University of California had made. It was there we go, argument number 1, argument number 2, argument number 3, and then argument number 5 was diversity. And that's the one that Powell went for. And it's very clear from the opinion, he thought he was opening the door just a little crack. There's no crack here. You can't do it that way. If the door's open, the door's open. And as a result, these policies grew and grew and grew. And by the time it got to Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, the momentum behind these policies was so great that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor ends up, siding with the progressives on the court, and again, she thinks, in her opinion, that she's, trying to bring it under heel. She says, in 25 years, we'll have to re-examine this. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Those 25 years are almost up, and we are still in the same position we were before. If anything, it has gotten worse. That's the thing about opening the door to race discrimination. It's very, very difficult to then close it. It took a long time to get from Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus the Board of Education. And that was a hard-fought battle. And we're having to fight battles like that again. I don't think it's fair to say that race preferential admissions policies are as bad as Jim Crow. They're not. But they're bad, and they have done a lot of damage to higher education. They've damaged higher education in a way that most people can't even see it because the mechanisms are too subtle for them to recognize it, but it's there.
Not only does you open the door to race discrimination, you certainly do that. You also open the door to creating bureaucracies, which have spread in the universities and increasingly in the corporate world, diversity bureaucracies, whose whole raison d'etre, whose whole justification for their existence is pushing for more racial preferences and also persuading everybody in the society, and in particular, members of minority communities. This is a racist society, and you really need us in this bureaucracy to protect you against the evil of the society. You've got now these people whose jobs, whose careers, whose lives depend on not on bringing people together, but on separating them, on creating more divisiveness, on creating more demands for preferences, and therefore for the preference bureaucrats. This is none of that would have been anticipated, I think, though perhaps it should have been, by the narrow majorities. And it was always the courts, the Supreme Court certainly, dealing with these issues, going back to Bakke and even before a case called Defunis in 1974. The courts from 1974 until today, until this very moment, have always been divided and very closely divided, and by typically by a majority of one. So it comes down to Lewis Powell in Bakke in 1978, or it comes down to Justice O'Connor. One lawyer on the Supreme Court in a country of 340 million people, deciding, well, I'm going to go for preferences, and I think it won't last for too long, and it'll be reasonable, and it'll be a good thing, and then it'll disappear, and with no anticipation and no foresight, maybe no ability to have the foresight for what the implications of this are going to be. So when a Justice Powell, who had been something of a gentlemanly, segregationist probably puts it too strongly or not, he'd been in Virginia back in the 1950s, a kind of senior guy, and wanted to do the right thing and use the word diversity, which nobody in this context had particularly heard ever before. One lawyer out of 340 million people, using a word that nobody had used before. And now the whole country is talking about nothing. 50 years later, 40 years later, is talking about nothing else. In a way, it's an evidence of how sort of crazily centered on the courts the United States can sometimes be. But it means if you're on that court, you have an enormous amount of power and therefore an enormous responsibility to try to get it right, which it seems to us in this book that alas, they have not got it right. Quite the contrary, over the last 40 years.
I love the contrast between Lewis Powell, who was this compromising, been president of the ABA, he's this sort of guy that's like, go along, get along, and the utterly irascible Stanley Mosk, who was a giant pain in the tush, but an intellectual type, interested in ideas and willing to stand up for what he thought was right. And God love him. It's true that sometimes in the world you need the Lewis Powell types, the kind of person that will be compromising. But sometimes, and I think this time on this issue, what you needed is a guy like Stanley Mosk, who was capable of standing up for principle, which he did.
Interestingly, all along, even before Bakke, there was a case called Defunis, which raised some of the same issues in 1974. And Justice William O. Douglas, of all people, known for I think he was the longest serving justice ever in the history of the country, or the second, maybe at this point, the second longest serving justice after Ginsburg. But in his time, he had been on the Supreme Court longer than anybody else ever had been. And he was known as being on the far left of the court. He was appointed as a New Dealer in the 1930s. He was still there in the 1970s. This was the judiciary's leftist and he wrote an opinion in Defunis saying affirmative action preferences, racial preferences, are a violation of the fundamental American constitutional idea that you don't discriminate on the basis of race. And the answer has got to be, in a public institution, this violates the 14th Amendment, this violates the requirement of equal protection, violates the idea that this is a country whose government does not discriminate on the basis of race. It was a terrific opinion. And would that the court had gone with Bill Douglas, of all people, on this issue, rather than imagining that you can, the way O'Connor and Powell and others on the court have thought, well, we can compromise this, and we can make everybody happy, and there won't be bad consequences. Douglas saw it correctly. Justice Mosk saw it correctly, and we think the people of the country, when they're given a chance in an initiative or a referendum like Prop 209 back in the 90s, and like the Prop 16 vote just in the last couple of years, this year, the voters of the country, unlike the elites, see this correctly, the way Bill Douglas did and the way Justice Mosk did.
I'll take the occasion here to wave my own flag. My contribution to A Dubious Expediency is an essay on diversity, and I guess I can be called a diversity specialist. I wrote a book titled Diversity, the Invention of the Concept, and another one titled Diversity Rules, bringing the first book up to date. It's not that I love this idea, but that it seems to me to be the path on which an anthropologist can most contribute to a set of doctrines which are partly legalistic and partly educationist. But I'll let that go for the moment. We have about 25 minutes left. I want to turn this into a lightning round in which we panelists give terse answers, and we allow the voices of our audience here to dominate. So I'm just going to go through these in order. Charles Merrick asks, I think I remember that affirmative action was originally meant to communicate that employers and schools would not discriminate in hiring admissions. Hence, company name is an equal opportunity employer, which is what we still hear in ads today. Do I misremember? Asked Mr. Merrick.
No, you do not.
10925 by President Kennedy used that word affirmative action, and it's very clear from the context what he means. He means you got to make sure that your supervisors know what the law is. At the time, the 64 Act hadn't even passed at that point, but there were rules for government contractors. You got to make sure that your supervisors know that they're not allowed to discriminate, and you got to make sure that they understand what that means, and things of that sort. Simply making sure, taking affirmative steps to make sure that you're not discriminating. And we've come a long way since then.
Daniel Wolk has a question that is directly for Maimon. Have there been any serious attempts to implement class-based affirmative action, that is taking economic disadvantage into account? And what are your opinions of it? By the way, I first heard about class-based affirmative action decades ago from Black intellectuals who are identified with the left and who advocated it.
I think Gail and I might disagree actually a little bit about this. I have a chapter in the book that's about class affirmative action. Yes, there have been and there are efforts in California and in other places around the country to do class affirmative action, usually not instead of race affirmative action, but in addition to it. I'm very skeptical of it. I think Gail takes a somewhat more sympathetic view of it, and you should hear from her in a second. My skepticism is based, for one thing, on the fact that where this has been done around the world, and it has been in India, where it's done on a systematic basis, and in the communist countries, where it was done in an abusive, very abusive way. This divides people by class. And puts people at each other's throats on a class basis, in the same way that racial preferences have the same effect, the divisive effect on the basis of race. And these are not the ways that you want to divide any society. And a second problem is that whereas race is pretty, there are crossover cases, but by and large we know it's who's of what race. The definitions are pretty clear. The defining class, very difficult. Almost everybody agrees that you shouldn't do it just on the basis of one financial thing, of income, for instance, because there are people, upper class people, who either don't have a lot of money or are able to hide the amount of money that they have, or they have the money in different forms. Everybody agrees that the classes more complicated and there are a lot more elements to it, and that gives whoever's going to have the power to bestow the class preferences a lot of discretion, which they can abuse, and they will abuse, in defining who's going to get the preference. And it invites gerrymandering, partly for racial reasons, and partly for political, ideological reasons, corrupt reasons. It invites gerrymandering of who's going to be eligible for the class preference and who isn't. So for those reasons and more, read the chapter, read the book. I'm quite skeptical of this. I think Gail, you should hear from her, who I think takes the view that as compared to race preferences, it's less corrosive and it's less poisonous. I actually tend to agree about that, but as between the two. But you should hear from her.
Okay, I mean, here in California, because race preferential admissions are illegal, the University of California engages in socioeconomic class preferences. And they do it with a much lighter touch because it's not really what they want. What they want is race. And when they end up with poor Asians and poor whites, they don't want them. And so they don't go so far. Mismatch is still a problem, so you can't go too far with this. You're just going to end up in the same position you were. On the other hand, the whole purpose of public education is to make sure that people with lower financial means are able to get an education. And therefore, a little light touch, especially when it applies to financial need, I am certainly for.
Light touches tend to turn into heavy touches.
We agree, but we are very close in our viewpoint on this. But I'm willing to cut the University of California a little bit of slack because I know that they don't want to go too far on this because they're not really all that interested in socioeconomic preferences. They're interested in race preferences, and they're plenty mad that they can't give those preferences to wealthy African Americans and Hispanics. That's what Prop 16 was about.
Gary K. asks, I understand STEM studies are difficult. I never could have done it. But in general, it seems to be the Ivies and other top colleges are so focused on diversification and social justice that they will do anything to add unqualified minorities by possibly eliminating the SAT and ACTs, by instituting grade inflation and using other measures. Aren't they going to continue to keep increasing racial preference admissions?
The answer, I'm afraid, is yes. Peter said, give a short answer. I'm afraid I can give a very short one. The answer, I'm afraid, is yes.
Gail?
Yes, but they can only go so far before they destroy themselves. If they want to destroy themselves, fine, then I want them destroyed too. But I don't think they really do want that. And there will be, if we get a strong Supreme Court case in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, and we really might. I mean, that case is currently under consideration by the Supreme Court. It's mainly about Asian Americans being discriminated against at Harvard. The Supreme Court is stalling on deciding whether or not to take the case. They asked for the Biden administration's view of all things. I mean, duh, do you really think that they don't know what the Biden administration's view on this is? That's stalling. But stalling could be a good thing here. If they're just trying to put it off until next year, fine, I'm willing to wait. But will the Ivy League destroy itself for this? I hope not, but it'll be a hard road. No matter how strong the case is coming out of the Supreme Court, assuming there is a decision and assuming that it is on the side of Students for Fair Admissions, it's going to take, at least a generation to dig ourselves out of the problem that we have now, and maybe longer.
Shoko Sakai asks, do you discuss the new academic affirmative action? We're not hiring faculty based on skin color, but we require that they have demonstrated expertise in diversity, regardless of the subject, math, chemistry, etc.
We do a little bit, and I think that the two essays that describe that go into it most detail and in most illuminatingly are one by Heather McDonald, who gives a terrific survey of the damage that's being done in the scientific and mathematical areas, and the other is Peter Wood, who writes about this in a terrific chapter, which I would say even if he weren't sitting right next to me, and which goes into this and tells you what's going on in a terrific and really pretty frightening way.
I'd like to second that Peter is really a gifted writer. I love reading anything that Peter has written.
Oh, thank you both. Robert Anthony Maranto, Bob to me, given that rich and often woke whites now benefit from affirmative action, which limits the number of Asians in elite institutions, what incentive do they have to support merit?
Well, they certainly have an incentive to avoid competition from Asian Americans who are in a weird and somewhat creepy way now in the position as we get into the 21st century that Jewish immigrant kids at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century were in. The colleges and universities, medical schools especially, elite schools and even not so elite schools didn't want Jewish kids at the turn of the 20th century and well into the middle of the 20th century. There were effective quotas not to let them in, but to keep them out. What the Europeans called a numerus clausus, a closed number, because you had the same thing in Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the people who controlled the universities here at Harvard and Yale, as in Europe, didn't want Jewish students who they felt worked too hard and studied too hard and were, the language of the time, greasy grinds. I'm sure it wasn't true of all Jewish students. No one accuses me of being a greasy grind. Certainly, Gail Heriot doesn't. That was the view of a lot of them. Not of me, but of a lot of the other ones.
That's what's funny about Lewis Powell's decision in Bakke, that he goes back and says, hey, Harvard has this program where they give students from different parts of the country, a little bit of a leg up in order to have people from other parts of the country. And like, whoa, Justice Powell, do you realize where that policy came from? It was an effort to keep Jewish students out of the Ivy League because Jewish students were concentrated in New York City and other large cities of the Northeast. And so to give a little leg up to somebody from Idaho meant, well, he's not going to be Jewish.
Yeah. Sometimes towards the end of that in the 1960s, what they got was the Jewish applicant from Idaho.
The one.
Asian Americans are now being discriminated against in exactly the same way. And whereas in sort of 1920 or 1950, it might have been a Jewish kid wanting to go to medical school who was kept out in order to keep, in order to give it to a prep school, a stereotypical country club, white kid. Well-connected alumni, and with far fewer qualifications. The same thing is happening now in behalf of affirmative action against first-generation Asian American kids who themselves arrived or their parents did absolutely nothing, and who through intense studying and deep commitment, and maybe a little bit of tiger mothering, have earned on their own work and on their own merits a chance to serve the country, and not just to have good careers for themselves, but to be able to contribute as well. And they are
lightning round, Maimon.
And they're kept out. So, yep.
Well, I should throw in the advertisement for the National Association of Scholars here. We have filed a succession of amicus briefs on behalf of the Asian students versus Harvard. So it's not true that all white people are trying to keep the system of merit suppressed so that we don't have to compete with Asians. Matt Lind writes, University of California has certainly tried hard to dishonestly get around Proposition 209. And now, in reaction to the defeat of its revocation, the regents have not only done away with SAT requirements, but will not even allow students to submit them voluntarily. This is no longer even trying to hide their illegal intent.
Well, certainly there, I think, immoral intent and damaging intent. What's legal and what's illegal at this point is the courts have been less forthright about this than I think they ought to be. But one of the effects of doing away with college boards and with serious grading is once again to put a premium on the advantages that the upper middle class and upper class households have to educate their kids and to get their kids ahead without the competition of of others. So that if the schools aren't doing the work, ultimately the better qualified person is going to have a huge leg up, and the person who has learned what you need to learn in order to succeed in the world is going to have a leg up. And if that's not going to be taught in the schools because we're watering down the standards, the people who are going to have a chance, best chance to learn it anyhow, are going to be people who have a chance to learn it at home. And that serves the interests, at least the short-term interests, of the upper middle class who are, and the elites, who are the ones, surprise, surprise, who are pushing these programs.
I have a feeling that this is also not going to go on forever, that the faculty was not behind the notion of getting rid of the SAT. And we'll see how that turns out. But I suspect that the fat lady hasn't sung yet on that.
Daniel Wolk and Shoko Sakai both wrote back in saying we gave good answers. That's positive reinforcement for the staff here. Caroline Moni, who is the editor-at-large of our journal Academic Questions, has written, liberal arts and even STEM subjects have been dumbed down and in some cases destroyed. Shakespeare, Greek, and Latin are no longer required, for example. Diversity hiring of faculty who are all trained in diversity will continue this, and there will be fewer and fewer faculty who can teach the classic liberal arts subjects. Is there a way out of this?
It's when you say correctly that Greek and Latin is no longer required, the latest thing just in the last few weeks is that the Greek and Latin department, which is called the classics department at Princeton, no longer requires Greek and Latin. Is there a way out of this? It's that in the long run, there needs to be, and there are debates, I think, among people like us about what that way out is. One idea is that new institutions need to be formed. You have a handful of mostly new colleges around the country. Hillsdale is a prominent example of new colleges mostly who are going to try to avoid being dependent on government aid as much as possible, and who are going to commit themselves to academic integrity and academic quality. That's one road, one possible solution. Another, and they're not mutually exclusive, I think, is to fight and to struggle within the universities to the extent that there are people willing to do that and able to do that. And in the courts, the Harvard case is an example of that coming up, where discrimination against Asians is at stake. So there are multiple ways in which to push back against a very destructive and very corrosive stream. Whether we will succeed, you never know until the end, and there's never an end of any of these games. But is this a struggle worth struggling for? I think there's absolutely no doubt that there is.
Richard Cronenfeld, given that federal funding comes with strings attached, can the federal government compel all academic institutions to use racial preferences in admissions?
Can it compel them to?
Yeah.
The thing is, the way they've been doing it for decades now is with carrots, saying, we will give you this funding if you can show that your program has diversity in terms of the students who've registered for it. And that's part of the problem, that they have been doing this for a long time, earmarking money that can go to schools, to those schools that can demonstrate that they have more minority students. Right now, the University of San Diego is trying to be able to get money that is earmarked for, I forget exactly what they call it, but it's the Hispanic equivalent of an HBCU, a Hispanic Serving Institution, an HSI, I believe. One of the essays in our book, one by John Ellis, who was also a member of the NAS, is about how when he was dean at UC Santa Cruz back in the 1970s, back in those heady days when we were all so naive about all of this, money was available for schools that would have more graduate students who were members of racial minorities. And at the time he said, yeah, let's go get that money. And who can blame him? I mean, it seems such a small thing at the time. And he talks in his essay about how he came to regret that, how he got to the point where he realized how corrosive that was of higher education.
The voracious appetite of universities for money means that there really is no distinction here between carrots and sticks. If I'm addicted to carrots, I will do anything to get those carrots. And that means that if not de jure, de facto, the federal government does require racial preferences in college admissions. Only a handful of really stubborn small colleges resist that.
The other way it's done is indirectly through accrediting agencies they're tapped by the federal government. As if you accredit a school, then we will make federal money available to them. And some of these accrediting agencies are absolutely ruthless in their pushing for racial preferences in admissions.
Bob Miranda is reminding us not to let K-12 and other administrators off the hook because they are very hostile to academic merit and to intelligence. And he cites, I guess that's his own book, Why Intelligence is Missing from American Education Policy and Practice, and what can be done about it. So go buy that book, or it's in the Journal of Intelligence, Volume 8. I don't know if a comment is needed there. It's very easy to hear Dr. Heriot, thank you. Well, I guess that means not so easy to hear us. Let's see. Many compliments for Gail Heriot. Professor Heriot is spot on. We could also note that preferential treatment is patronizing. I taught in an alternative school in Minneapolis back in the day. I was dean of students there, and we never lowered the bar, never in all caps. Those kids were fabulous. They had every reason not to show up to school. They came from the neighborhood along Lake Street, made famous by the recent BLM travesty there. Many of those kids went on to build wonderful careers in the sciences. So in my view, it is up to those of us raising these kids and teaching them to get them ready to compete and excel. I don't think any of us are going to disagree with that. A shout out here to Thomas Sowell, whose Discrimination and Disparities explains a lot of this quite well. Here. Seth tells us, the mismatch data on affirmative action seems to me dispositive, and Gail has done remarkable work on that. That an even more harmful effect that isn't empirically testable, probably, might be the psychological effect on being treated differently. We talked a bit about that. Doesn't having lower standards, be held to lower expectations, beget a permanent victimized class? I would imagine that affirmative action beneficiaries have to assimilate the view that the deck is stacked against them, that they were damaged in some way, and therefore the special treatment is necessary, just, and compensatory. Seth goes on a bit longer, but I think I'll cut it off there.
There's one more factor there as well. Seth is absolutely right. It's also true that if people are getting those preferences on the basis of the color of their skin, it means that for the rest of your life, when anyone glances at you, the first thought that will come into their heads, at least potentially, is this doctor, is this lawyer, is this scientist, is this faculty member in their position on the merits, or are they there because of preferences. And the person in question will also know that people, or will worry that people are having that thought. That's corrosive. And it builds up mistrust, and it builds up a sense of anxiety that shouldn't be there, and that goes on, that long extends past the time that you're in the college that you've been admitted to preferentially, and potentially is gonna it's gonna poison your enjoyment of your career for the rest of your life. So it's not just the factors that Seth talks about quite rightly, but there's that other side of it as well.
We're really out of time, but I'm going to add one more question and then we can close this. This is from Mike Wells. As we look at a college-age population decline in a few years, how do you see this impacting institutions with this current standard of race-based admissions? My institution seems to be fighting to admit every single person who qualifies to attend, no matter race, and it seems fiscal need is overwhelming the quality in the classrooms. So
kind of an interesting thought to think, if colleges and universities are so hard up for cash that they lower their standards generally, such that maybe there will be less of a difference, among races, and it will simply be that schools are far less selective than they are today. That would be sort of an interesting result. The alternative is that, excuse me, they could keep the differences in standards, but just move lower for all groups. And we'll have to see how this shakes out.
Right. I would suspect that the elite institutions are not going to be fighting for students as the college-age population declines. It already has declined significantly. We have about 3 million fewer college students today than we did 10 years ago, and the number, just due to demography, is going to continue to drop. But the effect on affirmative action, I would suspect, will be graded towards the colleges and universities that are not especially academically competitive right now, that do engage in racial preferences. At the high end, they will continue engaging in racial preferences, but the demographic slump won't affect them.
The top schools have gone global. That's how they protect themselves.
Below the top schools, there are all kinds of challenges, I think, and realistic threats, maybe desirable ones, to the education complex and industry. And there's a growing literature about this, but the schools that have colleges around the country that have thrived, at least economically, if not academically, in the past few decades, may have some unpleasant surprises waiting for them in demography, in economics, and in the growing recognition that the quality of what they're offering may not be compatible with the prices that they're charging. That the educational sector may look very different and be subject to storms that they haven't anticipated in recent years.
The truth is that higher education really needs a good spanking, and it may well be that hard financial times will benefit higher education in the end, that they will get their act together. Anything can happen, and the problem with the future is that it's hard to predict.
Well, Maimon, Gail, thank you for spending this hour and a half with me and with the, however, hundreds of people who've been watching. We had a lot of good comments. I haven't been able to get to them, but I expect to see a spike on Amazon as you all go out and buy copies for yourself and your friends and your associates, and Dubious Expediency into a minor league bestseller as we go about the effort to change the culture of American higher education and do something to fight against the wave of critical race theory that has become the latest instantiation of the racial preference craze. So thank you both. Thank you, listeners, for spending this time with us.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks,